Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Ulrich, Director of NYU Washington, DC, and would like to welcome you to tonight's event, co-sponsored with the NYU's Brademas Center. We will start our evening with the screening of the film Charlie vs. Goliath, a feature-length documentary about a former Catholic priest returning to Wyoming after working among the poor in Venezuela. Upon his return, however, he saw homelessness and hunger, poverty and despair, and decided to try and fix things by running for the U.S. Senate. This film chronicles one man's battle to take on the political establishment and show you can win in politics without discarding your values. Please plan to join NYU DC faculty members Tad Devine and Ron Christie for a discussion following the film. This dialogue will be moderated by one of our students, NYU DC Global Leadership Scholar, Manahil Zafar. So thank you, and please enjoy the film.
Hi, everybody. So on my left, we have Tad Devine, who received his A.B. in American History from Brown University and his J.D. from Suffolk University School of Law. He's a member of the Bar in Rhode Island and the District of Columbia, and a member of the Board of Directors and Secretary of the Corporation at IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems.
That's not ISIS, by the way. That's right.
Right up the top.
Since 1993, Tad has worked as a media consultant, writing, directing, and producing television and radio advertising for leading Democratic and independent candidates in the U.S., and providing strategic and media advice for national campaigns in Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. He has produced television advertising in 20 winning U.S. Senate and gubernatorial campaigns, and worked as a media consultant and strategist in 11 winning campaigns for president or prime minister around the world. And on the right, we have Ron Christie, founder and president of Christie Strategies, LLC. He's a veteran senior advisor of both the White House and the Congress, brings years of government relations and media experience. He previously served as vice president of Navigators Global LLC, a strategic consulting and communications firm. He previously served as executive vice president and director of global government affairs at Reuter Finn and of counsel at the Washington, D.C. law firm Patton Boggs, LLP. From 2002 to 2004, he was acting director of USA Freedom Corps and special assistant to President George W. Bush. He began service at the White House in 2001 as deputy assistant to Vice President Cheney for domestic policy, advising the vice president on policy initiatives in healthcare, budget, tax, and other policy areas. All right, we can begin. I think I left my questions.
Let the games begin.
I think I want to start off with asking you about Charlie's campaign volunteers and what impact they had on Charlie's campaign, because he only had 3, and that seemed to be enough.
Well, listen, I really enjoyed watching that film. I mean, I think his campaign volunteers had a great impact on him. They got him motivated every day. They were deeply devoted to his cause. They really tried to make a difference. And I know when we see something like this, you know, we say, you've got to be kidding, right? I mean, come on. You know, 17% of the vote, and is a major party nominee. How can people do something like this and be realistic? Well, you know, I'll tell you, I worked for Bernie Sanders, you know, when he ran for president in 2016. I worked for him when he was elected to the House of Representatives, when he was elected to the United States Senate. When he first ran for office in Burlington for governor of Vermont, he had a great campaign and got 2% of the vote. And so then he decided to run again, and he managed to get 1% of the vote the next time he ran, and he ran a third time, and he did a little better. And then the people who were with him, like those volunteers on the bus, people deeply committed to a guy who began to grow in number as he lost and lost and lost, but talked about things that were really important to them and made a difference in their life. Those people got together and they said, gee, we noticed you did pretty well in some neighborhoods in Burlington, some working class neighborhoods in Burlington. You did a lot better there than you did anywhere else in the state. Maybe you should run for mayor of Burlington, you know? So he did. And he won by 10 votes. And that's when he launched a career in electoral politics that carried him to the House of Representatives, to the United States Senate, and, you know, towards a serious trajectory to the presidency of the United States. So I don't dismiss in any way at all, you know, what Charlie Hardy did or is trying to do in the state of Wyoming. You know, Wyoming's a tough place, I can tell you. As a Democrat, you know, I haven't done a campaign there. I did a campaign once in Idaho for a Democrat, and we actually made a pretty good run at a senator called, and his name was Larry Craig. He's no longer serving in the United States Senate, but my candidate didn't win. But a couple of years later, he ran again, and he got elected to the House of Representatives. His name was Walt Minnick. So I think, you know, those people, that small band around him who started his campaign, I would not be surprised to see them grow. And the reason I wouldn't be surprised to see them grow, frankly, is because the message that I saw Charlie deliver better and better, it really looked pretty. The reason Mike Enzi didn't call him back, I think, was what he did to him in that debate, okay? I mean, he was really tough, and he was delivering what I think is the most powerful message in American politics, that we have a system of campaign finance in America that is corrupt, utterly corrupt. And that corrupt system of campaign finance is holding in place a rigged economy. And, you know, and I think Charlie has that message right there on the tip of his tongue. He's delivering it to people, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him get a lot more than 17% of the vote if he runs again.
All right. So Charlie is often compared to Bernie Sanders. What do you think of this comparison, and where do you think Charlie and Bernie most differ?
Well, good evening, everybody. I think that he's most similar to Bernie Sanders in that he's a populist, right? You know that for whatever, and of course, I'm a conservative Republican. I mean, I work for Dick Cheney, for goodness sakes, speaking of Wyoming. But you look at Bernie Sanders, and there's no doubt whatsoever that Bernie believed everything that he believed. And, you know, Tad was working with Bernie. I was working for Governor John Kasich when he was running for president. And there's nothing cooler than being in the middle of nowhere in a rural state and seeing a candidate who is a populist connect with people and talk to people. And I think that's really what Charlie did. He was able to connect with people, and you saw him with the soldiers in the barbershop. You saw him with the barber. You saw him with different people. And people were like, oh, you're running for president, or you're running for Senate in Wyoming? It reminds me of that scene where that guy laughs at him, and he says, you know, I'm a Democrat. You know, one of the other hats I wear is I'm the North American political analyst for the BBC. And we went down to Alabama to cover the Ray Moore race. And I was sitting in a diner, and this woman serving me, and I said, so, you know, what do you think you're going to do tomorrow? And she said, well, this is Alabama. This is the deep red state. My choices are, do I vote for a Democrat or do I vote for a pedophile? I'm going to vote for the pedophile. And so I look at and then I was like, gosh, I need to get out of here. So I look at that and look at the uphill battle that he faced in Wyoming. Where do they differ? I think they differ, and Tad, you would know this obviously better than I would. I think that he was sincere, Charlie, in saying, I'm not going to take any corporate money, any lobbyist money. I bet you your friend probably took money from special interest types. Would be my guess.
Which,
Bernie.
Bernie, no. You know, listen, Bernie and his, you know, the special interests, I suppose it depends on how we define special interests. If you accept contributions from the pack of the United Steelworkers, okay, you might say that's a special interest. I would say, you know, I'm glad those steelworkers are supporting his candidacy, you know, so sure, you know, in the course of his many years in electoral politics, I know he's taken money from labor, you know, committees. He's never taken money from, you know, Wall Street, big PACs, things like that. It's just not what he does. And I think the biggest and most important aspect of his campaign for president was we went out and demonstrated to the world that you can run for president of the United States. You can raise $250 million, which is what that endeavor did. And you can do it with an average contribution of $27 and receive absolutely no PAC money. We didn't take a dollar of it in the presidential campaign, and not be supported by the typical special interests that support almost every campaign in America. And by the way, when I say the system of campaign finance in America is corrupt, I'm not just talking about campaigns taking money from special interests. That happens all the time. We have election laws in this country that allow entities to raise as much money as they want, to spend it, if they want, anonymously on any campaign that they want to support, okay? Now, I do a lot of work outside the United States, and if people tried to do that in Europe or some other place, they'd go to jail, okay? It's absolutely illegal. You cannot just go out and spend money on a campaign and not disclose publicly where that money came from or why you're spending it. And yet we do it routinely here in the United States all the time. And I think that issue is growing. And with Bernie, I think one of the greatest contributions he made, I think, to politics in his campaign was a demonstration of you don't have to just theoretically oppose that money. You can practically oppose it, and you can do something about it if you turn to people and ask them to contribute to your campaign, which happened in his race.
Going along with that, Tad, I also have another question. What do you think would have happened if Charlie had agreed to take corporate sponsorships?
I think he would have got less than 17% of the vote, okay? I mean, I think the 17.5% of the vote he got was from people who understood and related to that message, you know? I don't see Charlie, I mean, listen, if we had $5 million for Charlie, could we have run that vote number up, to 30 maybe? Yeah, we probably could have, If we got him on TV and made some ads that people remembered. And I once did a campaign for Bob Reich when he ran for governor of Massachusetts. And believe it or not, we had a bus. It was a little bit better than that bus, but it looked a hell of a lot like that bus. And, when I first went and saw it, I said to Bob, why don't we just go on the bus and do some ads? And we did. We made some ads on his bus. It was called the Reich Reform Express. We drove around, Massachusetts. I interviewed him. We went and visited people. And the bus became a symbol of what he was trying to do, which is to, shake up the political system in the state. Unfortunately, he came in a strong second. I think if we had won that election for governor, I really believe we would have beat Mitt Romney, in the governor's race. He was on such a roll. But, symbols like that bus and what it represents with the right candidate and the right message, if they're delivered to people. I think in Bob's campaign, there was a classic example. We had about $1 million worth of TV. We needed about $2 million worth of TV. And if we had gotten it and gotten that message through, I think that campaign would have succeeded. I think Charlie would have done better if he had resources. But if he got them from the people that his message went against, he wasn't going to do well at all.
So, Ron, in your opinion, what was Charlie Hardy's biggest campaign mistake?
Well, honestly, I think his biggest campaign mistake was using his own personal money and leveraging himself and putting it on credit cards. I mean, it is so expensive, as Tad said, to run for office, but you don't want to bankrupt yourself in the process. And not having any money then leads to all the other problems that he faced. He couldn't get on radio. He couldn't get on television. He couldn't get a campaign consultant. Couldn't do all the sort of things that if you want to run as a major party candidate for the Senate or for the president or even for Congress, as we saw at the bitter end, you got to have money and resources. And I think that he really, I mean, his sincerity really came through of, I don't want that special interest money, but it's a big mistake to think that you can beat a special interest scenario that we find ourselves in with American politics to beat a Republican in Wyoming, already putting yourself before the 8 ball before you start.
Yeah. Now, do you think that's Hardy's mistake, or is it a problem in our electoral system?
Oh, I think it's Hardy's mistake. Look, there's no question. And I love the bus analogy, right? I mean, Tab was saying this a few moments ago. When my former guy, I used to work for John Kasich when he was in Congress, and when he ran for president, what did he do? He chartered the bus from Lady Antebellum, the country group, and we had 10 plasma TVs on the thing. We had a shower. Kasich had this huge bunk bed with its own plasma, and then you see Charlie sleeping on the floor. I mean, so the bus thing to me really resonated of how much of a shoestring budget that he was really operating under. But that sincerity, folks, comes through. I mean, I think other than that, the last part of your question was, what other mistake did he make?
No, it was just that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
What I just said, yeah.
All right. Tad, Charlie was running for Senate in a red state, Wyoming, with a
Ruby red, okay.
with a Republican incumbent, Mike Enzi. Realistically speaking, there wasn't much of a chance to begin with. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you think the significance is of fighting an uphill battle like that?
Well, that's true. I mean, listen, the likelihood of success for him was very, very low, just given the, electoral politics in Wyoming, and it's a very conservative state, maybe the most conservative state in the country, and in terms of Republican performance. The consequences, I think if you're going to change things, change doesn't happen overnight, okay? And I think what Charlie's doing in terms of contributing to change is actually real and potentially significant. You know, he's moving a message. And if that message, if it's true, I believe it's true, that that's the most powerful message in American politics. The influence of special interests, the way they use money to corrupt the political system, the consequences for people and their lives in our economy. That if you're in that message terrain, you know, I talk in my class about this sometimes, and I've come to believe that there's this place in electoral politics, and I call it the voter zone. Okay, and the voter zone is where the voters are. It's like the Twilight Zone sometimes. You know, you find it's a mysterious place. And I first found out about the voter zone many years ago, and Harris Wofford was running against Dick Thornburg in the special election for the United States Senate, and Thornburg started off 55 points ahead. And you know, there was a focus group in Pennsylvania, and people went into this focus group in rural Pennsylvania, and they started talking. And the person around the focus group said, "Well, how's the economic situation here? What about jobs?" He said, "Well, we're really concerned about our jobs, because if we lose our job, we're going to lose our health care." And they started talking about the environment. They said, "Well, we're concerned about pollution here because if we get sick, we go to the hospital, we don't have health care." And we talk about anything, no health care. And then when it was over, the guy came out and said, "I think they're worried about health care," okay? You know? And so, you know, we had a great ad with Harris Wofford where he stood in a hospital room and he said, if a criminal has a right to a doctor, then a person should if a criminal has a right to a lawyer, then people should have a right to a doctor when they're sick. And that was the voter zone, okay? And you know, and he started off 55 points behind. He won by 10, okay, against a very popular former incumbent governor, former Attorney General of the United States. This was 1991, and that was the canary in the coal mine of the 1992 presidential election in many ways. And Charlie, in my view, even though he may seem a little odd, a little eccentric, the whole bust, they got no money, everything else, you know what he's got? He's got a message, okay? And I want to tell you something. A message in politics is the most important thing you can have. And now, yes, the means to deliver it, the credibility of a candidate to seeking high office, all of these things are important subsidiary things as well. But I think, you know, this guy is actually contributing a lot because he's talking about a message that has potential to win, I think, anywhere in this country at the right moment in time.
All right. So if Charlie were to run for Senate again in November, how successful do you think he would be, considering that he has set up a precedent for outsiders in politics now?
Well, I don't think he'd run for Senate. The thing I wonder, given the fact that we saw him running in 2016 for Congress, I think he had the same likelihood. So I pulled this email came up. I will read this to you. This shows you what he's up against. This came in at today at 12:01 p.m. Save the date, June 15th to 17th. Please join Congresswoman Liz Cheney for a weekend in Jackson Hole. A barbecue with Dick and Lynn Cheney at their home. Now, and let's look at the limits, shall we? To attend, pack, $2,500, individual, $1,000. I guarantee you, given what we just saw with Charlie, not going to take special interest, not going to take PAC money, not going to take this. So this came in today. I would imagine, no joke, she'll probably get, if not tens of thousands, over $100,000 for this one weekend. If you think that Mike Enzi is a big name in Wyoming, try Cheney. Like, Cheney is the gold standard. Liz actually ran against Enzi initially for that primary that we see Charlie in, and she realized, oops, a young Cheney can't beat a elder Enzi, so I'll run for Congress. And so I think if Charlie, and I hope he does, and let me pick up on something that Tad just said, you've got to have a message, but look at what happened one cycle, and then we see him in the next cycle. What does he have? He's got young people. He's inspired the young people because he's got a message. And they're out there painting that. I mean, that bus was so metaphorical in so many different ways of they're painting the bus. They believe that this guy is the vehicle to break the cycle, to move them forward. And I guarantee you, while he won't win, he'll get better than 17.5%.
I agree with that.
That sounds about right. Tad, Charlie's campaign style focused on individuals instead of the people as a whole. Have you seen other campaigns mimic this sort of personalized style?
Well, I mean, you try to, but I mean, most of the campaigns that I work on, you know, there's mass media, there's, you know, a lot of money, there's, you know, and going door to door and doing it doesn't work as well. I've seen it, yes. I've seen it outside the United States. I've done a lot. I've worked in Ireland since 1997, and we canvass over there. We go door to door. People get their canvassing teams, they knock on the doors in their constituencies, and they speak to practically everybody who's going to vote, believe it or not, in the course of an electoral cycle. And that kind of politics really is enormously effective. I mean, people have questions that affect their lives, and they size people up. So we can't really do that much here. And trying to do it in Wyoming is very, very difficult. It's a really big place. It's 500,000 people, but they're spread out. I'm from Rhode Island. You can do a lot more retail politics in a place like that, but it's really tough to do there. So our politics don't lend themselves to it. For us, in California, I had a friend of my former partner used to say that a political meeting in California is 3 people around a television set. Okay, so that's the way we think of our retail politics here.
All right, so we've seen the emergence of people like Charlie Hardy, we've seen Bernie Sanders. Where do you see this trend of outsiders going in the future?
Oh, I think it's only going to grow. I think there is such dissatisfaction. I mean, Tad and I both travel around the country and around the world. I don't want to say we travel around the world quite frequently, but we've got our finger on the pulse, and I think that there's a growing sense in America that if you aren't beholden to a PAC or special interest money, then what's the point? And I think there's a certain cynicism that has evolved in politics. I mean, I've been at this game for 25 years, and I think people are finally fed up and had enough. I mean, where would you ever see a Bernie Sanders? I mean, Bernie Sanders really, I think, shattered, you talk about Hillary Clinton and shattering a ceiling. I think Bernie Sanders proved more than any candidate who's ever run for president of the United States that you can darn near beat off the establishment by getting $5, $7, $15, and those dollars start adding up. Remember that fellow with the ledger? I can only imagine what the Bernie ledger that you guys looked like when you looked at the internet haul, and it's not big money. And I think that's where we're going. Bernie Sanders has demonstrated that a populist candidate can catch fire and can inspire people, and I think that it's only going to increase the number of people who've said, I'm never going to run for office. They're going to say, you know what, the heck with it, I am going to run.
All right. So one last question, and then we'll open it up to you guys. What lessons can we learn from Charlie's campaign going forward, and are there any reforms, social or legislative, that you could recommend?
Well, I think the lesson for Charlie's campaign is, never give up. Okay, that yes, you start and it's very difficult, but you can build. I mean, if I were his political advisor, I would advise Charlie that, maybe it's good to run for the House of Representatives again and get your message out there a little bit more. But you might want to try to get elected mayor of your hometown. Mm-hmm. And after you do that, you might demonstrate, and this was sort of the course that Bernie followed, that you could be very effective and get things done. No matter what label people put on you or you put on yourself. His was Democratic Socialist, okay, which a lot of people were incredulous about, but which has never held him back, I think, frankly, in any election. And I think in terms of reforms, I think the reforms that he's talking about for our political system, which has to do with campaign finance, are the central reforms that we need to do. When I see, for example, what happened yesterday in Florida, my view of the reason that we can't have, sensible gun laws in this country, or that people can't get health care in this country who need it, mental health care and other things, is because we have very powerful interests, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, gun manufacturers, who don't want to change things, okay? And as long as that status quo exists, we're going to continue to have more violence in America than any civilized country in the world. Okay, so that's really the challenge. I think when people come to see things that way, and increasingly I think they are, I think change is in the offing, and I do believe that we're going to come to a time in America where our politics change radically, because there'll be reforms, they'll change money in politics, and that's when the real change will begin.
Now we're going to open it up to you in the audience if you guys have any questions you want to ask. There is a mic to your left, and you guys can just line up right behind it.
Hi. So I'm not entirely knowledgeable of Charlie's Senate campaign, but I was just curious as to how active was social media on his campaign, and why wasn't it used more as a means of free promotion, such as including that video of Wanda talking about the Do Nothing Congress?
Well, Joaquin, that's a great point, and I think the great advantage of social media in a campaign like that is that there's no cost involved, usually, right, of delivering a message. I mean, you can email people, you can post things, you can go on Facebook, you can go, in Twitter, you can go in other places. So I think the reason they didn't use it more, frankly, was they were too busy driving the bus and, just getting around. I mean, it wasn't like they had a huge coterie of people. I think one of the things that Charlie and the people around him are going to discover as people get more interested in him, in his campaign, is social media is the best place for them to try to move a message, because they simply don't have, you can't go and buy television ads and other paid media. So, and I would expect in the future that's precisely where they're going to go.
Hello, thank you guys for being here. My name's Josh. I want to start off my question by bringing to your attention, I'm sure you're aware, Senators Cruz, McCaskill, Manchin, and Feinstein are all facing challengers who don't take corporate PAC money. You saw that Charlie obviously faced a big hurdle, being outspent, but another hurdle he faced was people who did support his message. You saw a lot of people who thought, when asked about Washington, they thought it was corrupt, but when asked about voting for a Democrat, they laughed. Do you think it's a bigger hurdle for these candidates to overcome the spending or the kind of psychological part of these politics?
Well, I think it's both. It depends on the state, right? I mean, if you're talking about Wyoming or Alabama, if you're a Democrat, you might as well just pack it in because it's not going to work. If you talk about
Unless you run against Roy Moore.
Yeah.
Okay,
unless, yeah, oh God.
Normally you're right.
But if you look at a competitive state, if you look at Ohio, for example, a state that was more red, that's traditionally now purple in its affiliation, I think that you can be an outsider and run a competitive race, but you gotta have the money. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, we've both been around this game for a while. You have to have the resources to have a strong campaign. And going back to what Tad was saying a few moments ago, social media is the gift that keeps on giving. You can have your candidate out giving a speech, but you've got a support team back there that's tweeting. You're getting people to be engaged with you on Facebook. And of course, you can use this as a mechanism to also raise money and to generate interest. And one of the things that I believe that Charlie was hurt from was not having that team that they went to Cheyenne every single day and were dedicated to getting his message out. The candidate was great, but you need to use social media, I think, to bolster that.
Hello. I just wanted to start off by saying I love how this is like a bipartisan conversation. So shout out to NYU DC for promoting diversity. So my question is more, I'm going to quote Mitt Romney for a second. Corporations are people too. So what's both of you, I guess, your stance on, I guess, like Citizens United and like this documentary was very like anti-PACs, hard money, soft money. So, I mean.
Well, listen, I think the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court was one of the worst and most pernicious decisions the court has made in its entire history. I think opening the floodgates of special interest money legally and under the auspices of free speech is terribly destructive to our democracy and to our government in America. And I hope that it changes, either because the legislature changes and people pass laws that prohibit those contributions, or because the composition of the Supreme Court ultimately changes through appointments.
And see, here's where the bipartisanship comes in. Tad and I are good friends and have been friends for years, but here's where he and I would disagree. I think that under the First Amendment that being allowed to participate in campaigns, money is speech. And it's not just those evil corporations, but also for the first time that unions are allowed to open their treasuries and to donate. But here's where we do agree. The one thing that Citizens United has done is opened a spigot, opened a floodgate of money unlike we've ever seen before. When I was working with President George W. Bush when he was a governor, we thought, gosh, if we just have $75 million to get us through the primary, we can probably win this general thing with, say, maybe 150. Look at how much this lost. We're talking about a $2 billion cycle that we just went through. If we could win with less than $200 million, now you're talking $2 billion. That tells you there's too much money in the system. And these issue advocacy ads, you literally can dump unknown amounts of money in, don't have to disclose who is giving that money. And I think as a Republican, as a Democrat, I think it's really undermining our democracy in the sense that if you can pay to play, you're going to win. If you can't pay to play, you're screwed.
Thank you.
I agree.
See, I told you we'd find it bipartisan.
So my question also goes a little bit to Citizens United and reform. When I think of Tad, you're talking about the voter zone. I think there is a voter zone around campaign finance reform, whether you're a Democrat, Independent, Republican, and you look at the polls and you think all right, Republicans are just on board, just as much on board with this as Democrats. But then you actually look at elected officials, and it's a very stark divide. You look at the Republican Party agenda is just very anti-campaign finance reform. So why do you think there is that disconnect, and how do you envision that reform advocates would overcome that sort of reaching into the voter zone of the Republican constituents who seem to be sort of fed up with this problem, but also have Republican elected officials who are, in effect, against changing it?
Well, listen, I'd like to sit here and say it's all the Republicans' fault and the Democrats were so pure and we don't do it. But, I just can't, honestly. It's just not true, okay? The truth is that, our party, and listen, I'm part of this system. I make ads for these guys and, get paid for it. But, those are the rules. And, if you want to compete, if you want to win a competitive Senate race, or many, many House races that are going to be competitive this time, you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to raise money from people who can legally give it to you. And while it's true, I think right now, you'd get a lot more votes on a Democratic. I mean, if a bill came to a floor of the Congress on campaign finance, I believe there'd be a lot more Democratic votes than Republican votes. The truth is that the only time that we've been able to legislate true campaign finance reform was when we did it in a bipartisan fashion, and John McCain helped to lead it, okay? And that's the only way I think things are going to change, that in fact, this becomes something that both parties will suffer from if they don't do something about it. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to have, and listen, we saw this with Watergate, we saw this, in a generation earlier. There's going to be campaign finance scandals that become public. They'll become so toxic that people associated with it are going to lose elections unless they run against it. When that happens, we'll see reform in our politics. But until that big scandal happens, I think, right now, they've got a lot of protection under law.
Is the current system not scandal enough? I mean, it seems like we can continue to say that for a decade. The next scandal is going to come, and it doesn't feel like that is the solution in my mind.
I think it's percolating out there. I know, and Charlie is a good example of it. But I think, again, Bernie's campaign was, I think, the biggest example of this. That that campaign finance aspect was not just something that, the fact that we ran outside of that system and raised so much money, that wasn't the biggest part of the campaign. The biggest part of the campaign was that message that he delivered was central to the core economic message that really affected people. And I think that's what people are looking at. And listen, I'm seeing this all over the place right now in campaigns. It's breaking out all over America. People are moving to this issue. I've got a guy I'm working for in the 10th Congressional District in Virginia, a seat that's currently occupied by a Republican in a district that Hillary Clinton won by a large margin. And he's refusing to take corporate back money. And he's talking about it in a way that I think is really gripping people, because they're understanding his message. That's because people like Charlie and Bernie and others have come along and done the groundwork and the spade work for it, and I think people are starting to listen to it now.
Let me underscore what Tad just said, because I think what he said is so important when he used the term, it's percolating. You look to Shays Meehan, McCain-Feingold, the campaign finance reform legislation that we started kicking around in 2002. Where did that come from? It came from the corruption of the 1996 presidential cycle. You had the Democrats who were legally accepting money. You had Republicans who were legally accepting money. Both the campaign committees, the RNC and the DNC, were fined, and people were like, gosh, you guys are darn corrupt. Now, it took 6 years to really get a momentum to go. I think post-Citizens United, I think there really is anger. It's not just Democrats who are angry about this. I think that there are more independents and more Republicans out there than the establishment in this town gives credit for, who think, I've had enough. This money, you guys are all awash in it. We want something different.
All right, I'm curious what either of you think about public financing, and if you think a bill like the Fair Elections Now Act, which gets introduced and dies in committee every year, would ever have a chance of passing.
Well, listen, elected officials who get elected because they raise more money than their opponents are not going to pass a system of campaign finance law that levels the playing field, okay? It's not in their interest to do it. The only way that something like that is going to be passed is when, if you're against it, you're going to lose votes, okay? That's the only way it's going to pass. And listen, I think, campaign finance reform works. and that if you put in place that system, that would fundamentally change our politics. But I don't see anybody who's in office who benefits from the system wanting to change the system that helps elect them.
No, I agree with that. And you even look at President Obama, who said he was not going to opt out of accepting public money for the presidential. And of course, look at all the money that he raised. He said, oh, I'm opting out. So unfortunately, the system that we have, it protects incumbents. It's almost an incumbency protection act. What is it, 92%, something like that, of incumbents get reelected. So the system is tilted in their favor. They don't want to change the rules midfield because, goodness gracious, someone else might have a chance.
I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to point out that there are lots of politicians changing the system that got them elected in Washington, D.C. right now. There's a big campaign finance reform. Washington State, South Dakota, the voters voted for something, and then the legislature decided against it. But yeah, all that's happening.
And listen, that's how change happens, okay? Yeah. It's as Ron, it percolates, you know? And you know, one of the big things I think Bernie's doing right now is try to get people in their local communities involved in politics, elected to school boards, elected, and to try to change laws within states so that it will percolate up from the bottom.
But I did actually have a question as well. So how long until a Republican candidate in Wyoming or wherever runs on campaign finance reform? I mean, is that, it almost...
Wyoming? Never.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it feels inconceivable, but we're basically saying that that's what has to happen. But like how does that get rectified? When does a candidate run on that issue? Right now, it seems like there is like sort of a Tea Party sentiment, right? And where the Bernie and the Tea Party meet on that certain special interests have too much power, corporations and whatnot. So, you know, how long until a Republican runs on this?
Listen, somebody, I don't know about Republicans, but, you know, in terms of the Democrats, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see a Democrat come along and to run not only on that platform, but to be able to deliver a message if you have the means to do it. So, for example, in 1998, I worked for this young trial lawyer in North Carolina, never run for office before. His name was John Edwards. And he decided he wanted to run for the United States Senate against an incumbent Republican, and nobody thought he had a snowball's chance in hell. But what he had was resources, and he also had political talent, and we had a message. And one of the centerpieces of John's message, I mean, our slogan was John Edwards, the People's Senator, and we ran out a pledge not to take PAC money or money from Washington lobbyists. And it resonated with enormous power in that particular election cycle because we had a candidate who people were interested in, and we had the means to deliver that message, which was his own personal wealth. Okay, so listen, I wouldn't be surprised to see, you know, somebody in Wyoming, you know, some nice person who's got a great place in Jackson Hole, and maybe, you know, grew up there, who's, you know, got an extra 20, 30 million hanging around, that he decides he might want to run a campaign against it. And I just hope they give me a call when they do it, okay?
And don't be jaded, because, you know, Tad talks about his John, I'll tell you about mine. I mean, when I worked for John Kasich, who's now the governor of Ohio, when he decided to run for Congress in 1982, he had no money, no resources. He pledged that he wouldn't take any money from outside of the state of Ohio. And the way that he won is he knocked on every single solitary door and left literature on every single solitary house, apartment, condominium in the 12th Congressional District. And he was the only Republican to unseat a Democrat in 1982. He won because he had a message. He knocked on, and people, I mean, the Charlie thing is real. Yeah. The Charlie thing is real. If you can demonstrate and connect with people, and it was the same thing with Kasich, $5 turned into $20, $20 turned into $75, and that allowed him to continue to roam around the district, and it gave people hope that he said, I am your representative of Congress. I am not a member of Congress. I am your representative to Congress. And it works. So don't lose hope. Don't think that we can't change this. The percolating that we both keep talking about is very real, and it's getting more vibrant by the day.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, we're going to wrap it up for the night. But thank you so much for coming out. Have a good night.